provide an update on the current financial situation of Trinidad and Tobago. We're bringing you live coverage on TTT Talk City 91.1 FM and on TTT Live Online on Facebook. And we're just standing by waiting for the minister's press conference to begin.
3 to 4 days, there has been a precipitous drop in the price of oil. If I can give you some information, up to Friday, the price of the benchmark crude that we use, and really we shouldn't be using that as a benchmark, and I'll explain that in a short while, but we have used the price of West Texas Intermediate, WTI, for some time as a benchmark against which we do our calculations. The price of WTI on Friday morning was in the vicinity of $42 a barrel. Now, 2 months ago, the price of WT oil was $62. So between January and March, the beginning of March, the price of West Texas Intermediate dropped by $20, or 1/3. Between Friday and Monday, the price of that same benchmark crude dropped from 42 to 32. And yesterday it went below 30 at one point in time. I just checked the price as I came in here of West Texas Intermediate, and the current price is $33.11. So the difference between Friday, where it was just over 42, and today is about $9. So that represents, between the beginning of January and the beginning of March, or let's say up to today, between January 1st and March 10th, that represents a drop from $62 to $33. So it's almost a 50% decline in the price of oil, a little less than 50%. We have budgeted the national budget on a price of $60. Now, let me explain why I said that West Texas Intermediate is not the best benchmark price to use. You know, in the world, there are many different benchmarks, and I'll give you some of them that I look at on a regular basis. I look at WTI, of course. I look at Brent. I look at Urals crude oil, that is Russian crude, or crude up in that part of the world. I look at Dubai crude oil, that's another benchmark. I look at Oman crude oil, and I look at the OPEC basket, which is a group of oils in the Middle East. So we have been for some time in Trinidad and Tobago using WTI as our benchmark. We used to use Brent long ago when there was a lot of production from our East Coast, and the oil produced off the East Coast was similar in its properties to Brent. But as we began to have a mixture of oils in Trinidad and Tobago, we shifted to West Texas Intermediate. Now, I have asked the Ministry of Energy to give me information on the prices of the actual crude oils produced in Trinidad and Tobago. And we get oil from a number of different sources. We get oil from Perenco, we get it from Heritage. So there are a number of different companies that produce oil in Trinidad and Tobago. I could just give you some idea of them. Shell produces a small amount, BP a small amount, Heritage, EOG, Primera, De Novo, very small amounts. Perenco produces a substantial amount of oil, somewhere in the vicinity of 10,000 barrels. Heritage is somewhere over 30, about 33, 34. and the rest make up the difference, which comes up to about 60,000 barrels of oil. So in order to get an understanding of what price we sell at, I asked Ministry of Energy to give me the weighted average price of Heritage Crude, BP Crude, BHP Crude, Perenco Crude over the last 4 to 5 months. In fact, I have figures from October 1st to January 31st. The average price of Heritage Crude was $61.44. BP Crude, $62.77. BHP, $61.34. Perenco, $62.78, for an average for all companies producing oil in Trinidad and Tobago for the period October 1st to January 31st of $62.08 cents. So that up to the end of January, we were a little above our budgeted price of $60. Because really the figure we should be using is that weighted average price of oil that we get from all the different oil companies. For February, as the price began to decline, I explained to you that the price dropped from 62 to 42 between January and February and is now at 33. For February, Heritage Petroleum's average price had dropped to $53.93 from an average of $61.44, which still wasn't that drastic. The most recent Heritage cargo was shipped 2 days ago on the 8th of March at a price somewhere in the vicinity of $39, $39.8 actually. The reason why Heritage Crude is higher than the WTI is because there is a demand for the crude oil, contrary to some rumors said by others years ago. There is a serious demand for the oil produced by Heritage Petroleum because many refineries are configured, they have been constructed to process the type of crude that we get in Trinidad and Tobago. So on average, we get about $5 more per barrel for our crude than you would see posted when you look at WTI and so on. So the most recent price for crude shipped out of Trinidad and Tobago 2 days ago was approximately $40. Okay. Prior to that, in February, on February 25th, our crude was sold at $53.99, so call it $54. So in February, they sold crude at 54. 2 days ago, they sold crude at 40. Okay. So those are facts I need to put into the public domain. What I've done in order to prepare myself for this press conference is I've looked at the structure of the revenue that we get as a government, as a country. Now, if you go back to 2015, fiscal 2015, you will see that our total revenue at that time, which would have been October 2014 to September 2015, was $57.2 billion. Because the price of oil then collapsed over that period, October 2014 to 2015, the revenue dropped to $44.9 billion in 2016 and then went to its lowest level in 2016-2017 of $36.1 billion. So between 2014 and 2016, let's call it fiscal 2015 and fiscal 2017, you had a fall off in revenue of $21 billion. And that flowed directly from the collapse of oil prices at that time when oil dropped to $26 in February of 2016, I believe. It was either February or March of 2016. We put in place a number of measures at that time, a number of things. We restructured our energy tax regime, and that's a very important point. One of the things that you need to do when you have persistently low oil prices as a country, as a oil-producing country and an energy-dependent economy, what the learning tells you that one of the things you have to do is to move away from a profits-based energy taxation regime to to a volume-based energy taxation regime. In simple terms, what this means is that you move away from petroleum profits tax as your primary source of revenue, and you move towards royalty as your primary source of revenue, royalty on oil and gas. The difference is that if the companies, the oil and gas companies, make no profit, then you will get no petroleum profits tax. So if they run at a loss, which is what they told us they were doing in 2014, 2015, 2016, and so on. I had a visit from BP right in this very room in 2015, shortly after we took over the government or assumed office. And BP showed us a graph, which I think people are quite familiar with, that we would not get any petroleum profits tax from them until the year 2024, 2025. And that was because they were projecting losses for all of those years. So when you're faced with something like that, you have to shift towards what is called a volume-based taxation regime, which is what we did. So we then imposed a royalty in 2017 across the board on oil and gas at 12.5%. Prior to that, there was not an across-the-board royalty on all hydrocarbons. What that has done for us, it has actually doubled the revenue from petroleum between 2017 and 2019. As I said, that is the learning, and that's what you have to do. Russia is very good at this. That's why Russia is so successful in the energy world, because they extract revenue from royalties primarily, and they don't use petroleum profits taxation as their primary source of revenue. So being aware of this, I decided to shift our taxation model more towards the royalty side, and as a result, we've had a doubling of energy revenue, petroleum revenue since then. It helps in the bad times, because even though the oil is down now to $33, as the case may be, we're still getting royalties. If we had remained with a taxation regime that was focused mainly on profits, we get nothing. And in fact, if you look at what happened to revenues from petroleum over the period 2014 to 2016-17, it dropped from $20 billion down to $400 million. We lost 95% of our revenue. So that is where we are right now. So having looked at what's happening, we've done a projection going forward for the rest of fiscal 2020. Up to now, we were fairly on target with our revenues. As I told you, we achieved an oil price of just over 60, and together with the production volumes we were achieving, we were more or less on target in terms of fiscal operations for the first 4 months of the year. It began to fall off from February when oil price started to drop off, and obviously now it's a very serious problem. So we've done our projections, and we're using now an average price for the year of $40 oil, and a wellhead price for gas. Again, there's a lot of confusion about what price we use for gas in calculating the national budget. There's a misconception that the government uses the Henry Hub price, which is what you see posted on the internet. We don't. We use a wellhead price, which is the actual price for gas produced in Trinidad and Tobago. So we had used a wellhead price of $3 for the budget. We're now using a wellhead price of $1.80. We're assuming a sort of a worst case scenario. So we're saying oil will average $40 for the fiscal year, and gas will average a wellhead price of $1.80. Our calculations tell us that this will result in a loss of revenue of somewhere in the vicinity of $3.5 billion for the year. So that is the information I have thus far. Just to give you some supplementary information, energy sector revenue in 2014 was almost $29 billion. It was $28.5 billion. And by 2016, that had dropped to 7.5. So 21 billion had dropped out of the energy sector revenue between 14 and 16. Last year, we got that back up to 17 billion. So we were able to increase it from 7.5 billion to 17.0 billion, which is almost a $10 billion increase. And that's based on a combination of things. As I said, we reformed the energy taxation regime to give us more revenue for the hydrocarbons that belong to us and all the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And we also did some restructuring of the tax regime. So that we're estimating a loss of revenue of 3.5 billion. What I can tell you, though, is that in 2017, we had a fall off of between 14 and 17 of 20 billion. So this is why I said we've been down this road before, and we have been able to successfully come out of it by very careful management of the economy. So right now we're formulating strategies on how we deal with this loss of revenue of $3.5 billion. But as I said, we have gone this way before, and we came out of it very successfully. So I'll open up the floor to questions now.
The budget has estimated a deficit of about $5 billion. Now that a little over $5 billion, now that you've added another $3.5 billion, that's about $8.5 to $9 billion deficit. How do you plan to finance this deficit?
Well, if we keep our expenditure at the level that we planned, we obviously will have to finance it through two mechanisms, actually three. One would be borrowing, obviously. Secondly, drawdowns from the Heritage Fund, but we'll have to do some restructuring of the manner in which that fund operates. And thirdly would be extraordinary revenue, sale of assets, and so on. So we're formulating a plan right now on how to deal with the $3.5 billion shortfall. We had already projected to finance the $5 billion that was stated in the 2020 budget.
So is it, so you expect to keep your expenditure?
That's the plan at this point in time.
You took a more expansionary approach this year than last year.
That is true.
You increased by $2 billion.
That is true.
Do you need to keep that?
Well,
and because there's some who would look at it and say,
Mr. Williams,
can I finish
no,
my
Mr.
question?
Williams, please keep your sentences tight. I have a, Mr. Williams, I have a sitting of Parliament this afternoon at which I am piloting the Revenue Authority bill. Mr. Williams, just keep your sentences
I'm
tight.
asking if I'll be allowed to ask questions.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm saying that there's some who would suggest that the reason you're keeping this expansionary approach is because there's an election this year, and therefore you're prepared to borrow and spend in order to finance your election ambitions. How would you respond to that?
That's it?
If you want, you can answer.
Okay. We are still planning to keep our expenditure target as is. One of the problems with slashing expenditure is that it stifles the economy. So that when you have a situation like this, you cannot react with a knee-jerk reaction and just slash expenditure, because there are all sorts of implications that come out of cutting expenditure in a drastic manner. We have bills to pay to suppliers. We have the question of refunds to businesses for VAT. And we have to keep people in jobs. So you just can't willy-nilly pick up a cutlass and start slashing your budget like that. Remember, we have cut expenditure from the heady days of 2014 by $10 billion, even though the expenditure profile for 2020 is $2 billion more than 2019. It is still $10 billion less than 2014. So we do not intend to stifle the economy. Any other questions from somebody else?
Pertaining to the HSF, how much, if you all have decided, are you all considering to take from it?
No, I explained that in the Express today. The way the Heritage and Stabilization Fund is structured, the way the law was written, was that you can only withdraw from the fund after the fiscal year is completed. So since we still have 6 months of the fiscal year to go, we can't contemplate a withdrawal from the fund until the 1st of October 2020. So it doesn't help us in the short and medium term. So unless we restructure the Heritage Fund to allow a withdrawal in a situation like this. The Heritage Fund is not available to us at this time. And that's what I meant when I answered by saying that we're looking at borrowing, we're looking at withdrawals from the Heritage Fund, but that will require some restructuring, and also we're looking at extraordinary revenue sale of assets and so on. So we can't take anything out of the Heritage Fund as of today.
And this restructuring of the Heritage Fund, will that...
Well, what you would do is that you, instead of looking at it over an annual basis, look at it over a quarterly basis. Because funnily enough, deposits to the fund are structured that way, that you put in money every quarter. I don't know what the thinking was back in 2007 when they did it that way. What I could say is that in those days, the government's account at the central bank was in credit, a lot of money in it. There were tremendous surpluses. I remember 2006, 2007, we ran a budget surplus of $11 billion. So I guess in those days, there was so much money available in the current account that the view was, look, you could draw down on your overdraft at the central bank immediately before you have to look at the Heritage Fund at all. Obviously, that has changed because the overdraft has been maxed out now since 2015. So that we may have to consider withdrawals similar to the way deposits are made, because it was every 3 months you look at your estimate of oil prices and gas prices, and you see whether you're above or below your estimate. And if you're above, you put in some money. If you're below, you don't put any, but you can't withdraw. But then you have to wait for the entire 12 months before you can withdraw. So perhaps that's a option, that instead of having to wait a whole year to withdraw, you can withdraw on a quarter-by-quarter basis. But it's something that needs a lot of discussion with stakeholders and so on. Of course, you'll have to go to Parliament. So that is not something we'll rush into either. We won't jump into that at all.
And you made mention of Parliament. I'm not going to ask this question. Do you anticipate support from the opposition to change if you decide to go that way? Change?
I haven't raised it with them. I have no idea whether they would support it or not. I don't know. But I mean, it's a simple majority legislation. It doesn't require a special majority. Of course, you would like their support. I always do. But I can't say. I haven't spoken to them about that. Because we're far away from that. Far, far, far away from any such thing. One of the good things about the Heritage Fund is that it doesn't increase the public debt. So you get two benefits from withdrawal from the Heritage Fund. Public debt is not increased as it is with borrowing, and you also get foreign exchange, which helps your reserves. So in a time like this where foreign exchange income will be down because we get it from the energy sector, so as prices go down, foreign exchange inflows will go down. A withdrawal from the Heritage Fund is really quite a good thing because you get foreign exchange coming in, all the assets are in US dollars, and also your public debt doesn't go up. But I'm just saying that when it was originally designed, it wasn't designed for quarterly withdrawals, it was designed for annual withdrawals. Okay?
And you made mention of borrowing as
well. Where are you from?
I'm from the Express.
Right, okay.
Can you say how sustainable borrowings are, and how long do we expect to borrow, and how would it impact on the country's debt profile?
Okay. I had said in the budget of 2020 that we are looking at borrowing a debt-to-GDP ratio. Now, this was not in contemplation of anything like this. At that time, we were projecting wellhead gas price of $3 and weighted average oil price of $60. So at that time, there was no contemplation. I don't think anybody in October in the world was contemplating the coronavirus and what it would do to world markets and supply chain and all that sort of thing. So that I had said at that time that we were looking at an upper limit for borrowing a debt-to-GDP ratio of 70%. Okay? At that time, we were somewhere in the vicinity of about 62, 63%. We're now closer to 64, 65%. So that if I stay within the parameters that I have already announced 6 months ago, or 5 months ago, as the case may be, then we still would be able to borrow about 5% of GDP, which is about $8 billion. And we came up with a figure of 70% based on a lot of modeling we've been doing for many years as to what is the optimum debt to GDP level that we as a country should stop at before debt service payments become too onerous. So we can, based on all the advice we have received from all our international advisors and so on, we can go to a debt to GDP ratio of 70%, which would allow us to borrow about another $8 billion and manage the debt service payments comfortably. What we're doing now, in order to make it easier, is we're stretching out debt service down into the 20-year horizon. We have a profile of debt that we look at all the time. Some debt is maturing in 2 years, some in 5 years, some in 10 years, 12 years, and now we're looking at debt going down into the 15, 20-year area, which stretches out the payments and makes them less onerous. So yes, we can handle it. We've been looking at this for several years.
You spoke about one-off revenue limits. Are most state enterprises going to be listed on the stock exchange?
Well, this is something you have to be very careful about, because you don't want any knee-jerk reactions. You don't want to sell off things at a time when prices might be depressed and so on. So we look at it. But what we've been doing over the last 4 years is using all sorts of different mechanisms to generate revenue. As I said, we improved the energy tax regime, and we've reduced expenditure, and we did a lot of one-off. We had a FCB IPO, there was a TTNGL IPO, there was a NIF bond issue based on recovery of assets from CLECO. There's not a lot left inside of there. There is still a substantial amount, but nothing like what we had before. So that we will be looking at that, but we just have to be very, very careful about what we do, because we don't want to prejudice the possibility in the future, if we have another problem like this, that we don't have any options available to us. We have options.
Mr. Imbert,
Mr. Williams, hold fire. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? You mean nothing to do with oil prices? Okay. Is there anybody else who wants to ask? No problem.
Karen, yeah. Just to clarify, where would we, or who would we borrow from?
Oh, you borrow from a number of different commercial banks.
Local, international?
Mostly local. You may recall I went on a road show around 2016, and that was all foreign borrowing, where we borrowed about $1 billion from about 100 different investors. At this time, our borrowing is purely local, so we borrow from Republic Bank, from Scotia Bank, from First Citizens Bank, from First Caribbean, from Royal Bank, and so on, all the commercial banks. And we do it by way, most times, by way of a request for proposals. So we invite tenders and then evaluate the bids. We look at the interest rate that the banks offer us, the period of the loan, whether it's fully underwritten, what the commitment fees are, what the legal fees are. So there's a point system. Obviously, the interest rate is the most important thing. It gets the highest weighting. And based on that, a bank is selected for lending to the government. And we do this on a regular basis.
So you need to go to the IMF?
No. Where did that come from?
Just asking.
Okay. But that's the point I want to make, that we've faced this kind of problem before, and we have weathered the storm, and we will weather the storm on this occasion. The idea of going to the IMF is preposterous. The IMF is the lender of last resort. The countries in the Caribbean that went to the IMF, I wanted to give you some information now. Their debt to GDP ratio was 175%. So Barbados and Jamaica had a debt to GDP ratio up at that level, same kits, 175%. If we had a debt to GDP ratio of 175%, our total public debt would be over $300 billion. Right now it's just over 100. So that we are nowhere close to them. Those countries have to go. Because when you hit 175% and you've borrowed so much, and debt service takes up so much of your what they call your current revenue, your tax revenue, nobody else wants to lend you. So that you go to the IMF because they're the lender of last resort. We're nowhere near that. In fact, there is a $250 million loan that is maturing within the next couple of months, and we had already planned before this occurred to go on a roadshow to the United States to refinance that and maybe get another couple $100 million US dollars on the foreign market, because it's always a good idea to have a profile in the international market when you're borrowing. Otherwise, nobody knows who you are. You'll be surprised when you go on these road shows. A lot depends on personal-to-personal contact and what you say, and how you react to the question posed to you by investors. So that's one of the things we were contemplating last month, going on a road show later this year around June, and maybe borrowing about 400 or 500 million US, of which 250 would replace existing debt, so it wouldn't increase the public debt, and then taking advantage of low interest rates that exist in the international arena. But we're revisiting that now, obviously, because we don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. What I can tell you is that interest rates have dropped in the United States. The Federal Reserve did a drastic cut to interest rates just last week, substantial cut, so that we will look at all our options. But at this time, we're borrowing primarily from local and regional banks. Okay? Well, Ms. Javid, I want to stress that in 2016-17, government revenue dropped to $36 billion, which is $20 billion less than it was 2 years before that. And we survived. Okay, we strategized, we adjusted, we reorganized, we exercised fiscal discipline, and we survived. I don't anticipate revenue in this year to drop to $36 billion. Remember, half the year has gone already. Eh? And our projection for revenue for this year, we had projected about 47, so we'll be down 47.7 actually, so we'll be down at about 44.2 if we lose the $3.5 billion. You have to understand as well, these oil price, volatile oil price changes are very, very unpredictable, you know. You don't know what's going to happen next month. Right now there's a price war, it appears, between Russia and Saudi Arabia, so it appears. It may very well be the real target of the two of them is shale oil producers in the United States, because when oil prices collapsed in 2016, that was the target. What had happened in 2016 is that the production of oil from shale, because there's shale oil in the States, not just shale gas. You know, there's a lot of talk about shale gas, but there's a lot of shale oil in the United States. And in 2016, shale oil production exceeded production from Saudi Arabia and Russia. In fact, America became the largest oil producer in the world in 2016, and began to export oil for the first time in 40 years. So that frightened OPEC and Russia. The fact that America could start to export oil, and they were ramping up production rapidly. So the price war in 2016 was really targeting shale oil producers in America to drive them out of the business. This time, there's the global coronavirus shock. So it's complicated. It's not just an attack on shale oil producers. But all my reading tells me is that part of this price war is directed at shale oil producers in the United States to try again to drive them out of the business and get them out. So what happened the last time? Saudi Arabia and Russia went at it for a couple of months and then gave up. Decided this doesn't make any sense because you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. Because if you drive the price down, of course you get less revenue. And what began to happen to Saudi Arabia, they had to start tapping into their, what they call their heritage fund as well, in the billions, because they couldn't support their budget. They have a very social-oriented country. They pay for a lot of services for their citizens. So they had to support their social programs. They had to jump into their heritage fund in the many billions of dollars. I don't know if they're prepared to do that again. So 2 months from now, the price may go back up. But we are planning for an average price of $40 right down to September. And as I said, we have managed a fall off in revenue of $20 billion before. I think we can manage a fall off in revenue of $3 billion.
Minister Imbert, perhaps I can now get a chance.
No, hold on.
No.
Mr. Williams, Mr. Williams,
Mr.
Williams.
Excuse me.
We need to maintain
People have
civility
asked-
in these
people
exchanges.
have asked 3 questions. I've asked 2.
Mr.
Can I
Williams.
have one, please?
Hold on, Mr. Williams. Yes, Mr. Javid. Had you finished your question, Mr. Javid? You're good?
Or are we continuing the soliloquy?
We need to maintain civility in these exchanges.
Yes, but he needs to also
No,
be civil.
no.
Anyway, I'm not even having Minister Imbert. Are you going to answer the question or you're not?
What is the question,
All
Mr.
right.
Williams?
I have 2 questions for you. One, can you tell us what is the production of natural gas that you're basing your revenues on? What is the production level? And secondly, I've noticed in the last 4 years, you've consistently been wrong significantly on your oil projection. 2018, you said 4.2, it was 2.4, 2.2. 2019, you had 4.1, it was 3.15. This year again, you're wrong. Is it that you're not being conservative enough in your estimations?
Mr. Williams, what is the question, please?
Okay, are you prepared to listen again? Let me go through slowly. You seem to have consistently been wrong in your budgetary projections and your actual receipts for energy production and prices. And I said to you in 2019, you had estimated 4.281 billion. You got 3.391 billion. This is in oil revenue. In 2020, you estimated 4.5 or so billion, 4.54 billion. Clearly, you're not going to achieve that by your own estimates. Similarly, in 2017, you estimated 1.075. You received 472 million. So I'm asking whether that is a reflection of a lack of conservative planning, or is it that you've been making these assumptions and you just happen to be unlucky that every year you're significantly off in your estimates? That's one thing. And the second
Mr.
thing,
Williams, hold on. That's your question?
and the second one.
No, Mr. Williams.
So you can remember, the second one has to do with you kept us here for half an hour waiting on you, so it's okay. The second one is that whether or not what is the production level of natural gas you're estimating your revenue streams on.
Okay, that's the 2 final questions.
2 easy questions.
Those are the 2 final questions from you, Mr. Williams. So, our natural gas figures for 2019 average out at just below 3.6 billion. We expect that to continue in the foreseeable future. 3.6 billion standard cubic feet of natural gas per day. That's the production we expect. In terms of oil revenue, I think last year we exceeded our projections. So I don't know where you're getting your figures from, and I don't intend to argue with you about that. Okay, any questions from anybody else?
Yes, 2 questions pertaining to this, and then on the note COVID-19, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
Pertaining to the Heritage Fund, what, if any, hit did it take regarding the tussle for prices between Saudi Arabia and...
From what I've seen, the stabilization fund lost about 5% of its value over the last 2 weeks or so. But I did see a recovery in the fund last week, believe it or not, because the fund is not just invested in U.S. stocks, it's invested in bonds and so on. So that when you have a crisis, people shift their money from stocks to bonds and the yields change. So in fact, I saw a recovery last week of over $67 million in the fund. So right now the fund is just under $6.3 billion. So it's lost about $300 million in the last couple of weeks. But prior to that, it had gained $100 million in 1 week and so on. So it's very volatile. It's a long-term fund. It's invested in long-term instruments, so that it's not something you could look at immediately. The fund was doing exceptionally well before this happened. It had hit $6.6 billion just last month. So that I'm reasonably comfortable with the way the fund is being invested and the performance on the fund. I think the fund will be okay in the short to medium term. The fund managers, in fact, were meeting yesterday to discuss it at my request. I asked the Heritage Board to meet and just look at the markets and look at how the structure of how they have the funds invested. whether they should move out of stocks into bonds and that sort of thing, because a bond is a fixed instrument. Okay, so that we should be all right.
Any decision taken whether or not to move from?
No, I haven't had a report from them yet. I only asked them to meet yesterday. And again, it's not a knee-jerk thing. You have to be very, very careful. You don't just jump. Okay?
And pertaining to the sale of assets, have you all identified?
Not yet. No. We are looking right now at all of the options available to us for dealing with that deficit, and it will involve borrowing, possible sale of assets, and possible withdrawals from the Heritage Fund if we restructure the fund. So no, we haven't looked at anything yet, no. Because again, you have to look at this from a long-term perspective. You can't just assume that this thing will go on forever, because it didn't in 2016. And you have to understand the countries that are involved in this, they're hurting. All of them are hurting. So they're not going to take that lying down. They're going to deal with it in some way. There has been an attempt by OPEC over the last 2 weeks to try and get agreement on production cuts to stabilize the price and so on. Russia is not a member of OPEC. So it's a kind of spoiler where that is concerned. And that is why when OPEC members agree to cut production, to boost prices, Russia counteracts by boosting production. As OPEC reduces production, Russia increases production because it's not a member of OPEC. So it's not bound by any agreement among the members. But these things don't last forever. As I said, all of these economies have large social programs, as we do. And if you look at the structure of any oil economy in the world, because of the revenue that comes from oil, the countries have developed huge social programs, all of them. So when you have a hit like this, you're hitting straight at your social programs. And none of these countries are minded to disrupt their social programs in any way. So these things don't go on forever. In fact, I remember way back in 2008, 2009, when oil dropped down to $35 just in a couple of months from 145. So it was 145, and the next couple of months later it was 35. It's the biggest drop I've ever seen. It went back up very quickly to $70 because, as I said, these producer nations can't afford to keep that price down at those levels for too long because they can't survive. And the United States shale oil producers can't survive at that level. Okay?
Moving on to COVID-19 a little bit.
No, hold on. Any other questions on oil and...
Minister, given the turn of events, any plans to bring forward your mid-year review? Or is it just
No. That's still planned in April. And that's not far away. I mean, it's already the 10th of March. So that I'm looking at somewhere around the 10th of April, or if not the 10th of April, towards the end of April, for the mid-year review. And I mean, we're planning it right now. I spoke to budgets yesterday about that, to see what can be done. So any other questions on finance? No? Okay, now I do have to go to the Parliament. I have to go to the Parliament. So we'll have to break up within the next 10 minutes or so. So could you keep your questions tight if it's on other matters?
Last night during the Wednesday's Monday night forum, the opposition leader accused the government of wrapping up over $122 billion in public sector debt, saying at least 2 of the loans benefited the senior government minister.
That's so interesting. The debt-to-GDP ratio stabilized about 2 years ago at about 62%. So we've been constant in terms of our public debt for the last 2 years or so. The government borrows, as I said, from the commercial banks. We borrow from Scotiabank, Republic Bank, Royal Bank, First Citizens Bank, First Caribbean, Answer Merchant Bank, and NCB Global. Okay? Someone gave me some excerpts from the opposition leader's speech last night, and I must say, I continue to be amazed at the things that she says. And I'll tell you why. When we go out for an RFP, it's on a competitive basis. So for example, when a bank is selected to lend money to the government, it's based on the best offer. So as I said, we look at the interest rate that they would offer. That's the primary thing. So whether they offer it us at 4%, 5%, etc. That's the first thing you come on to look at. Because when you're working out whether you should select one bank over another, you have to figure out how much it will cost you. So let's say you're borrowing $100 million. If someone lends you that at 5%, that will cost you $5 million a year. If somebody else lends it at 4%, that will cost you $4 million a year. So the 4% interest rate is obviously better. But then there are other little things that you need to look at. What they're going to charge you for what is called a commitment fee, what they're going to charge you for legal fees for preparing the documents, and so on. So you will do an entire model of the whole thing and see what the value of this loan is based on the offers from all the banks. NCB Global is one of the many banks that are invited to tender to lend money to the government. NCB Global is owned by a Jamaican billionaire called Michael Lee Chin. Okay? It's the largest integrated financial services group in the Caribbean. It's the second largest financial group in the Caribbean of any kind. Republic Bank is the largest. NCB Global is the second largest. Not NCB Global, NCB, which is the parent company of NCB Global. It has assets of 12 billion US dollars, over 80 billion TT dollars in assets. So when the government borrows from Scotiabank or Republic Bank, or the case may be, we borrow from the bank. So the government has borrowed from NCB, not from Angus Young. That's the absurdity of what the opposition leader is saying. Angus Young is just an employee of NCB. He doesn't own NCB. NCB is owned by Michael Lee Chin. He just works there. So that the idea of the government, after competitive bidding process, going through the whole modeling, and it's done by the people in my economic management division, my debt management unit, examine everything and come up and say, all right, for this loan, Republic is the best. For this loan, Scotia is the best. For that loan, FCB is the best, and so on, based on the interest rate and so on. And they have the asset base to cover it. I heard some nonsense about they don't have the asset base. As I said, NCB Trinidad is owned by NCB Jamaica, which has an asset base of 80 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. So all of these things are just nonsense. The entity that benefits from the borrowing is NCB, which is owned by Michael Lee Chin. And as I said, the largest integrated financial services group in the Caribbean. It owns Guardian Life, for example. You may have heard recently of the takeover of Guardian Life by NCB of Jamaica. So how on earth could an entity that owns Guardian Life, has $80 billion in assets, be incapable of lending the government $100 million? And how on earth could an entity that is owned by a Jamaican billionaire called Michael Lee Chin benefit the brother of a cabinet minister? It's nonsense. And I don't know why the opposition leader continues along this line. Maybe she thinks it will sink in when she says it over and over to her supporters, but it's all nonsense. Okay?
Just
yes.
to clarify, you're from NCB or NCB Global?
They're the Trinidad subsidiary, as far as I'm advised, is NCB Global Financial Holdings. But it's a wholly owned subsidiary of NCB Jamaica, which also owns Guardian Life.
And the loan was from NCB Global or NCB?
When we borrow in Trinidad, we borrow from the Trinidad entity. So it's a wholly owned subsidiary of NCB Jamaica. Okay, so it's backed up by its parent, which is always the case. When we borrow from RBC, Royal Bank of Canada backs them up. When we borrow from First Caribbean, which is, and then I heard something about First Caribbean too, I was astonished. First Caribbean was previously called CIBC, Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. It also has assets of 12 billion US dollars. So I couldn't understand what all this noise was all about. Okay?
Has the COVID-19 impacted any of the projects that are currently ongoing?
No. The only thing I could see from COVID-19 that will affect us is the supply of materials. A lot of materials in the world, structural steel and things like that, come from China. So there may be delays in shipments out of China because there will be more stringent checks in ports of call and so on. Okay? Not as far as I know. Okay? I have to go to Parliament. Thank you very much.
And that was live coverage of the Minister of Finance's media conference on the current financial situation of Trinidad and Tobago on TTT, Talk City 91.1 FM, and on TTT Live Online on Facebook. Remember, you can find out more about the top stories coming out of today's media conference in our major newscasts. I'm Mahalia Joseph Wharton. Have a good afternoon.
This is TTT. Live for local.